5 years in Iraq, 7 years in Afghanistan. These wars have placed a great strain on the U.S. military, so much so that some argue that American armed forces have reached their breaking point. Do U.S. troops have what they need to fight these wars? And what if a new conflict arose? Would the military be able to respond with the swiftness and coordination to which the world has become accustomed? We'll look at these and other issues next on Great Decisions.
In a democracy, agreement is not essential, but participation is. Join us as we discuss today's most critical global issues. Join us for Great Decisions. Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association, inspiring Americans to learn more about the world.
Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.
A year ago, the Army's Vice Chief of Staff dropped a bombshell. General Richard Cody told Congress the Army had neither the time nor the resources to prepare for or conduct other missions it could potentially face around the world. And this is hardly the first time in recent memory the Army's overall capabilities and readiness have been called into question. From the early days of Iraq and Afghanistan, when we read reports of soldiers buying their own body armor, to the proliferation of the improvised explosive device and the need for more up-armored Humvees, and later the stories of extended tours of duty. To many, it looks like the U.S. military has been playing catch-up. The military says this because the armed forces are facing a new kind of conflict with a new kind of enemy, and therefore have to adapt. It takes time. But how will that learning curve and the additional forces and resources it requires affect the military in the future?
The bottom line is, today, if there's a tsunami that hits the United States, if there's another war in a place like Korea, we will be in a position of enormous strategic peril because we have under-resourced and damaged our fighting capability.
Of primary concern to the top brass is making sure troop levels hold. Military recruiters are doing everything they can to meet recruiting goals. They've raised the maximum age from 35 to 42. They accept more recruits who score at the bottom of the Armed Forces qualification test. And they're taking more soldiers with criminal records and what the Army calls moral turpitude. And consider this, Navy SEAL spots are only 86% filled. Yet last year, those who passed the physical exam for entrance into the elite squad jumped from 34 to 77%. At the same time, more recent graduates of the Army's West Point are leaving the armed services than before.
Nobody wants to use the word draft. But the truth is that nobody knows if you can expand the volunteer army in wartime conditions.
Iraq and Afghanistan have shown us that the responsibilities of modern armed forces encompass more than just fighting and winning battles. U.S. soldiers must now be builders, policemen and women, town administrators, social workers. Is today's U.S. military prepared to take on those responsibilities? Do American troops have the equipment and training they need? Are there enough troops? The next President of the United States will have to address these and other problems, including paying for all of this. The annual budget for the Department of Defense is nearing $500 billion, and that does not include the costs of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which now stand at more than $378 billion. Everyone admits that's a lot of money, and it doesn't even include the cost of casualties on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. Waning war machine, the state of the U.S. military. Next on Great Decisions.
And now from our New York studios, here is Ralph Begleiter.
Welcome to Great Decisions. Joining us now to discuss the stresses and strains on the U.S. military around the world are Larry Korb, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington, and Thomas Donnelly, Resident Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. Welcome to you both.
Nice to be with you.
Do either of you disagree with the premise, which is that the American military is stressed and strained at this time? Is there any reason to disagree with that?
Well, I would say it's the ground forces. The Navy and the Air Force, I think, are in reasonably good shape. So when you say the military, I think you have to distinguish between the Navy and the Air Force and the Army and the Marines.
And Tom?
I can't disagree with Larry. You could probably even slice it a little finer. I would say that the Army is the service that's most suffering.
And that's because of the war in Iraq or a variety of things? Where are U.S. forces deployed these days?
Clearly Iraq, Afghanistan, we shouldn't forget the Horn of Africa, and a lot of other small detachments throughout the Muslim world. And the Marines are constantly afloat doing their normal marine business in East Asia and in the Atlantic as well.
And we always forget the U.S. still has 35,000 troops, I think, in South Korea at this point as well. That's the demilitarized zone there as well. So deployments all around the world. Americans think of the two wars. Often they think of just one war. How has the 4-5 years of the war in Iraq strained the ground forces? Tom?
The way you should think about the war, the way I think about the war, is that it's more a marathon than a sprint. And our forces were designed and optimized to fight rapidly and to create decisions rapidly. So it's the duration of the conflict more than the size of the deployment. It's the constant cycling of forces in and out of, again, particularly Iraq and Afghanistan.
Larry, do you think that it was a mistake to be planning for the short-term deployment and not be thinking about a longer-term deployment?
Well, anybody who knew anything about the history of Mesopotamia, as it's called, knew that it was not going to be short. General Shinseki, who was the Army Chief of Staff, tried to warn them that you'd need several 100,000 troops for the long haul. The Deputy Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Defense basically said, well, that's ridiculous. Why would you need more after you overthrow Saddam than you would have to overthrow him? And so what happened is they basically misjudged it. Now, I think there was another reason for it. I think if you had told the American people exactly what you were getting into in Iraq, they would not have supported it. Francis Fukuyama, the diplomatic historian who wrote the book The End of History, put it very well. He said if you told the American people that you were going to go to Iraq and you'd have, close to 4,000 deaths, 25, 30,000 wounded, 100,000 Iraqis dead, spend $500 or so billion so Iraq could have an election. These are Frank's words. You'd have been laughed out of the ballpark. They never would have supported it.
And I think many Americans, and I think people all around the world for that matter, look at the American military and see it as the best equipped, best trained, most highly honed, civilian-controlled, most powerful force in the world. Are people surprised to discover that it's a short-term force that can't sustain even a multi-year deployment in a place like Iraq? Tom?
Well, no, it shouldn't be a surprise. If you sort of know the forces as with some expertise, you would understand that it's a force that's, again, optimized to produce a quick decision, to be able to strike. You might say it's a force that's ready for battle but not really ready for war in the sense of this long duration kind of operation. And one thing that may have compounded the political misjudgment was a misunderstanding about the changing nature of war, how technology was changing war. There's a movement called the Transformation movement that, again, emphasized long-range precision strikes, technology, and the wars that we found ourselves in are those that most reward boots on the ground, land force presence.
And all of that.
I want to make an important point. Tom is right that the active force was designed for this very quick war. But when we set up the volunteer military, we understood that you could have a long war. You had a comparatively small active duty army because manpower is very expensive once you ended conscription. And the Army has the most difficult time recruiting people. You had the Guard and Reserve that was to serve as a bridge to conscription, which is why we make people register. We make 18-year-old males go down and register. So if you were going to have a long war, you should have, after you had to activate the Guard and Reserve to support the deployment, particularly in Iraq, you should have moved to the next step. But again, there was no real desire on the part or no real willingness on the part of the American people to do that, so they didn't do it.
Tom?
This may seem like a pedantic debate about history, but the policy is really tightly interwoven here. The volunteer force was a stepchild or a product of the aftermath of Vietnam, and part of the lesson was we don't want to do that again. We want to set up a very high
Don't want to
bar.
have a draft again.
We don't want to have a draft, and we really want to avoid a protracted counterinsurgency operation. So part of what the Army leadership did, and the folks who designed the all-volunteer force, was to put this threshold in that Larry talks about. It would have been fine, and the situation certainly would have been different, but for the drawdown at the end of the Cold War. If we'd still had the land force that we had 10 years or a dozen years ago, the ability to sustain large-scale operations in Iraq with the active force, because this is the kind of war that really demands professionalism in the guys who are fighting it. You don't want to send a conscript out to the streets of Fallujah or the hills of Kandahar or something like that. So it is almost kind of a perfect storm situation that we found ourselves in.
I want to come back to Larry's comments about the National Guard, because I think maybe that was one of the first times in the last few years in Iraq that we began to observe the cracks, if you will, in the longevity and the ability to sustain a longer war, was when we started to see National Guard units being called up again, tours extended, sent home but sent back again very, very quickly. We spoke with General Barry McCaffrey, who's a former military commander who also now teaches at West Point, and he commented on this question of the National Guard.
Well, I think, one of the things we've got to do is go back and fix the National Guard. People aren't aware that when you look at this country of 300 million people and 11,000 police departments and tiny state police forces, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people, when there's an emergency in this country, the National Guard or the active military are the only people that can carry out large muscle movement operations. And the Guard doesn't have their equipment. We have to go back and fix that soon. It can't be a 15-year recovery effort. We've got to do this in 2 or 3 years.
Now, McCaffrey's point actually takes us beyond the Iraq context and back into the domestic context. Many Americans think of the National Guard as essentially a domestic force that plays into domestic crises like the ones he mentioned. And yet, in the last few years, the United States has relied on the Guard to support the war in Iraq. How do those two things interact? Do we have the forces on the ground to deal with domestic issues, Larry?
Well, after September 11th, the Guard got a new mission, and that was homeland security. It's not just to deal with natural disasters, but it could be a man-made disaster. And at that time, you needed to recognize that you could not rely on the Guard the way you may have wanted to. And the idea
could not rely on them for a war abroad.
For a long, extended war. And what the Army has done, the Department of Defense, they've changed it from what we call a strategic reserve, which is, all right, we'll use you for a stopgap until we can get more forces, to an operational reserve. They're rotating exactly with the active force, so there's no different. Now, that's bad for two reasons. Number one, if you keep calling up the Guard like that, you're going to have a lot of trouble keeping people in the Guard. They're going to have problems with their employers. But the other is you're leaving your homeland naked. And right now, there is a threat to the homeland, as we saw on September 11th.
Tom, do you agree with that as far as the Guard is concerned?
I think you need to refine the picture a little bit. And some of these strains were even present back during the years of the Balkans deployments. General McCaffrey talked about
You're talking about Bosnia and
Kosovo. Yeah, precisely
in the 90s.
So. We saw a lot of the Guard units that have been called constantly to active duty are military police. Guys and women who tend to be state troopers or local police in their day job, so they do a very similar function when they have a military uniform on. So it's very difficult for, when you're deploying a National Guard military policeman, you're often pulling a guy out of a local police force or state trooper. And also, the structure of the Guard hasn't kept pace with the changing political realities. There's still too many National Guard tank battalions, again, units that were designed for the Cold War that really aren't applicable in the same way to today's force. So, in fact, the whole structure of our land forces is really out of sync and out of whack with what we've asked it to do, both at home and particularly abroad since 9/11.
Circling back to something else that General McCaffrey mentioned, and I think, Larry, you touched on it too, but I want to clarify the point. He talked about the fact that the Guard doesn't have its equipment domestically, when they need it domestically. It's been shipped over to fight the war. So that's a separate issue from the manpower question. That's an equipment issue. Comment on that a little bit, Larry.
Well, I think that's something that you really need to be concerned with, because a lot of the Guard units, when they were sent to Iraq particularly, as well as Afghanistan, left their equipment there. So when they came home, they didn't have the equipment they needed to deal with a man-made situation, nor did they have the equipment to train on when they were getting ready to go back. In fact, many of them, when they're called back, the first time they get the equipment they're going to use is when they're actually over there in the theater. And as General McCaffrey said, you're going to have to spend an awful lot of money resetting both the active and the National Guard units. In other words, get them the equipment that they should have had at the beginning of this war and restore it to the capability that's supposed to have.
Again, I would basically agree with Larry. It's unfortunately always been the case that National Guard units have been kind of at the bottom of the food chain when it comes to getting the good gear.
Stuff.
Yeah, sure. Because the active force will always deploy initially. So obviously you want to give your first to deploy units the best that you can give them.
A few minutes ago, Tom talked about Vietnam, and he talked about the draft. I want to come back to that for just a second. And you said that you wouldn't want conscripts fighting in Iraq, I think is essentially what you said. Do you agree with that? You wouldn't want
Well, basically, you've got conscripts, because the idea, Tom was right, the volunteer military is supposed to be professional, which means people enlist usually from a minimum of 4 years. The Army's so desperate to get people now, they're allowing them to enlist for 15 months. Go through basic training and then go right over there. I mean, we've sent a lot of young men and young women to Iraq right out of basic training, which is essentially what you were doing during the draft years. And the Army's also had to lower its standards dramatically in order to get people to volunteer, because the country has turned against the war.
Setting politics aside for a minute, which I know is going to be difficult to do, should there have been a draft in the post 9/11 months, perhaps a year or so?
I think if President Bush was determined to go to, we all knew he had to go to Afghanistan. Iraq was obviously a different issue. But if it's clear that he made up his mind pretty early, maybe as early as late 2001 to do it, that's what he should have done. Because again, when you go into a military operation, you obviously always hope for the best, but you got to plan for the worst. And again, knowing the history of that part of the world, you should have known it would be very manpower intensive, and looked at the levels that we needed to deal with other insurgencies and other countries have. You would have needed many more troops.
Would it have solved the problem, Tom?
A draft would not have solved the problem. I think a draft would have compounded the problem. Look, this is really almost the toughest, most demanding kind of land warfare. Often the most agonizing decisions are whether to pull the trigger or not. Is that person over there a friend or an enemy? Is that woman wearing a suicide vest, or is she a mother with, looking for her kids? You don't want to send a soldier who's not physically fit, not as well trained as they can possibly be, and not superbly equipped into that kind of situation.
So what are you saying? The United States Army is required to recruit more people? They're having trouble now.
I think letting the immediate post 9/11 moment pass without committing to a large-scale expansion of the professional land force was a huge strategic error, one that we need to correct. Whatever one thinks about Iraq and Afghanistan, if you look at the American involvement in the Middle East, going back to the creation of Central Command a generation ago, two things are true. The number of forces in that theater has exponentially risen, even pre-9/11. I mean, we did fight a big war against Iraq in the early 1990s. And again, I wish my stock portfolio had performed in the same way.
Short-term war, though, early 1990s.
After, we flew more no-fly zone air sorties after the war than we flew combat missions during the war. There were Army brigades and Marine expeditionary units in that theater in Kuwait on a day-in, day-out basis for 10 years. The nature, the size of the commitment under multiple administrations has gone up, and the nature of the commitment has shifted from an air and naval presence to an increasingly on-the-ground presence. That's a trend that's been true for generations.
I'd like to pick up on Tom's point about, yes, you want very qualified people because this is an incredibly difficult situation. But what's happened is the Army is not getting very qualified people. As General McCaffrey pointed out when we testified before the Congress, the Army last year, even after lowering its educational standards, its aptitude standards, gave 10% of the people coming in what the Army calls moral waivers, including 900 people with felony convictions. That's the people that we're sending over there right now because, again, what we call the influencers, the mothers, ministers, priests, rabbis, and coaches are telling youngsters who might want to join the Army, you don't want to join now in the midst of this very unpopular war.
Does all this essentially argue against the concept of a volunteer army, that basically you've got to find out some way to increase the level of forces without a draft? But how are you going to bring qualified people in a volunteer situation?
This is a job for political leadership. Again, I would certainly fault President Bush, and I would really hope that our next president can help heal some of these wounds, because this cannot be a Republican Party war. It's got to be an American war. And so there needs to be some political consensus about the obligation to serve this country in uniform. And the Army and the military as an institution does a superb job of taking young people who may, even those who are don't meet the standards that we used to stress, and turning them into very good soldiers. So we certainly have a generation's worth of success with this all-volunteer force, and it's a very fine institution for producing professional quality soldiers.
As we come to the end of our program, I just want to turn back again to the hardware question. The military famously likes to look at the newest technologies, the new ways to minimize perhaps the need for manpower on the ground by using high technology. Has the United States perhaps tilted too much in the direction of weaponry and technology and not enough attention perhaps on the issue of manpower?
In my view, they have, because if you take a look at the shares of the budget that since the end of the Cold War up until a year ago, they were exactly the same as they were during the Cold War. And the Army got the smallest share because, again, as Tom pointed out, during the Cold War, we really wanted to use technology because the Soviet Union had many more people under arms. The budget shares didn't change. Now, last year they finally did, when President Bush agreed that we needed to increase the size of the Army and the Marine Corps. But you still have a lot of weapons that are built designed to, deal with threats from a bygone era, during the Cold War. I left the Pentagon in '85. They're actually doing 2 weapons that they started when I was there, and bringing them into the force now. Those should have been canceled and the money used for other things, particularly manpower.
We've also got to focus again on the hardware question. It's not just a manpower problem. General Wesley Clark, former NATO commander, says the United States needs to focus more attention on providing better hardware, especially for ground forces in the United States. Let's listen to what he has to say.
Well, I think if you look at a military, it takes 4 things to make it. Leadership, we've got great leadership. Combat experience and the proven effectiveness and courage of an organization, we've got that. But I think if you look at the equipment, you'll find our equipment's, at least for the land forces, is in pretty rugged condition. A lot of it's been used up. A lot of it's waiting rebuild. We haven't actually yet put the money into the kind of massive, rapid overhaul we need. We've got a 2 to 5 year backlog of repairs, and with each year of combat, we're building up another several months beyond that of repairs that have to be done. So the backlog is actually growing. This is a problem.
So let me ask you this. What message, sort of to the world, does the United States send with the combination of factors we've been spending our time talking about? Does the United States send a message of a prepared military or an unprepared military, one that doesn't have enough equipment, doesn't have enough manpower, but is still the most capable in the world?
Well, I think General Clark was pointing out, the Army needs more equipment. When I was talking about, I'm talking about the fact that you went too heavy into sophisticated equipment for the Navy and the Air Force, and that's the point. I think he's right, and we call that resetting the force. The Army has to be reset, get it back to where it was when this war started, because when you buy a tank or a truck, you assume it's going to last for so many years. You go to a place like Iraq, you burn it up 6 times more rapidly than you normally do. But what I would say is our military is still in great shape overall. to fight a conventional war. We need to learn more about dealing with asymmetrical warfare or insurgencies.
I again, basically agree with Larry. We are living off the investments that were made back when Larry served in the Pentagon, and there's just no getting around the need, not simply to replenish the force, but to refocus it and reshape it for the new conflicts that confront us today.
Tom Donnelly, Resident Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, thanks for being with us. And Larry Korb, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Thank you both for being on Great Decisions.
Thank you.
And thank you as well for joining us on Great Decisions. I'm Ralph Begleiter.
To learn more about topics discussed on Great Decisions, visit our website at www.greatdecisions.org. To order a copy of the Great Decisions Briefing Book, a DVD set of this series, or to join a Great Decisions discussion group in your area, contact the Foreign Policy Association. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by the Star Foundation and U.S. Trust.